I want to ask you what your prescription would be for next year in any case. Given the need for transferring the GST compensation to the states for this year, next year, if the government's assessment is that growth will not be as strong arithmetically or optically as this year, what needs to be done? Because one route is to try and stimulate consumption at the bottom end of the pyramid in some way. The other way is to throw your money at the investment basket and try and stimulate the economy that way. What would you advocate?
Well, you know, we are already doing things to support the income levels at the bottom, and those should certainly continue. I mean, for example, the MGNREGA expenditure, which is actually demand for rural employment programs has been much stronger than was projected. So I think we should allow for that fully under the nature of the legal provisions of MGNREGA. That is, in fact, an automatic entitlement, and next year's budget should allow for that. You know, otherwise, quite frankly, I think the notion of treating consumption as something that would lead to a recovery is, I think, a little misleading, because, you know, consumption will recover when incomes recover. So there is a case for doing something for the poor, and we should certainly do that. But any other stimulus of demand, in my view, should go in two areas. One is to strengthen health expenditure. That's not actually necessarily investment, because a lot of it may well mean supporting expansion in health services, certainly vaccinations in the coming year. But other than that, it should really be investment oriented. And if you're clear about this well in advance, and we are going to do more expenditure, that's where we should concentrate on. But you know, that decision has to be based logically on the assumption, clear assumption, that look, if we don't do it, then growth will not be what it should be. We cannot simultaneously claim that we are going to grow at 7.5% and say that we also need fiscal stimulation. So I think from an analytical point of view, what we need is a clear sense of what's going to be the growth rate without the stimulus, and that if that's not good enough, then we justify stimulus. But even there, for the next year, it is from a macro point of view, and it's not fair to throw this at the finance minister, because the central budget cannot pronounce on the states. But I think we need to be clear what is the fiscal position of the states. And the problem there is that the fiscal position of the states is not very transparent. And most of them are running much larger deficits than they show. They're simply not paying the bills. So I think to get a good sense of what the macro balance should be, we have to take a combined view of the two and then say, look, this is what you're aiming at, a combined deficit of so much. And for that, maybe it's worth saying, how much are we going to allow the states to borrow? Because after all, in that sense, the central government controls the total amount of borrowing that the states can do. And that should be added to the central deficit. So we say we are targeting a combined deficit of whatever it is.
Now, this combined deficit number cannot be too small, as you know, Montek, and that is the rub of the problem. Because if the finance minister, as she probably will, takes your advice and says, I will not get too hassled about the fiscal deficit getting a little out of control for the near term, but on the other hand, that runs the risk of inflation actually getting even more entrenched, and that's a problem which is fairly global right now, and in India too. So would you worry about inflation this year as you talk about a loser fisc, or would you say, let me help the economy on the fiscal front and let the Reserve Bank deal with inflation?
No, I think, look, the inflation connection is not necessarily determined just by the fiscal deficit. The inflation factor is determined by how much you monetize the deficit. I mean, if you simply, the problem with deficits is that they squeeze out the private sector, okay? So if you do more government expenditure, there's less for the private sector. If it is your judgment that private investment is not going to expand, then it makes sense to say that, look, until the private sector recovers, we are going to give a boost on government expenditure. That boost will be an investment-related government expenditure, because that is what contributes the most to the growth of the economy in the longer term. I come back to what I said. A lot of people, because they think on the demand side that consumption somehow contributes to growth, they say, well, if growth is slowed down, why don't you speed up consumption? Well, actually, consumption is an endogenous factor. I mean, an economy generates consumption when income occurs and income expands. So our focus should be on expanding income. The best way of contributing to the medium-term capacity of the economy to grow is to increase investment. And the biggest shortage in India right now is in terms of both the quantity and the quality of infrastructure. Now, that's an area where the government is deeply involved. It has had ample advance notice of what needs to be done. And if a clear decision is taken that we are going to do this much on the capex side of the budget, I think that makes a lot of sense, and we should do that. Now, the important thing in the fiscal deficit is really, if your trajectory is seen to be one where you're not bringing the fiscal deficit under control over 3 or 4 years, then I think there's a lot of cause for worry. That's why it's the medium term that matters. And the critical thing in the medium term is what's the growth rate, because that's what determines the denominator. I mean, if you get stuck with a set of policies that don't generate growth and simply say, I've got a good fiscal deficit, I don't think that that's going to impress anybody. But if you can persuade people that, listen, I'm running a little bit of a higher fiscal deficit this year, but I'm also following policies that will actually stimulate growth, I think people will perceive that in the medium term, you're making the right transition. And that's what we should be focusing on.